knew Robert Harris, or Bob as I knew him, in the early 80s particularly, and further into the 80s. Bob I found rather intimidating because he was quiet, he was his own man, so it was hard in a way for me to get to know him and like him, because he did have that strong sense of his own independence. The great news was that Bob had joined our little legion of Jesus freak Christians, and he attended the same church that we did, and were doing Bible studies. We were sort of feeling our way through being some kind of alternative brand of Christian intellectual bohemians. I'm very touched by the experience that Bob seems to have undertaken by becoming a Christian poet with his roots in, if I could call it, beatnik or bohemian poetry outside of the political establishment. The poetry that moves me most by Bob is the poetry where he tries to describe what it is to be this kind of outsider Christian, a Christian who is not in the mainstream. His poetry doesn't describe being a mainstream Christian, but it also seems to describe how he becomes an outsider to his generation. And I think a poem that is, in a sense, a hinge for his conversion seems to have come from the early 70s. It's called Easter Poem, and it was published in his book Localities, which was his first book of poetry. It's a very short poem. It goes like this. Christ, your pitch of light enshrines our lives, which in their turn perpetuates your cross. And I gather that Bob read a poem about Christ at a poetry reading in Darlinghurst towards the end of the 70s. I'm pretty sure that's what he told me. And I'm guessing that the first poem in his collection, The Cloud Passes Over, which is called Ray, might be describing what happened during that poetry reading to him. He had a sense that there's something dangerous about talking about Jesus in polite company, and it played on his mind to the point that he felt he had to make a decision. So I'll read Ray, and it seems to me that it's almost a conversation with the Hound of Heaven from Francis Thompson's poem. Here's Ray by Robert Harris. It seemed wise to get it wrong about his Ray, trying to plunder Christ. For I heard the appalled hush at his name in a bookshop during a poetry reading. Soon he was calling, not he without his friend, in from behind the winter wind. The loudest rain could not drown that soft knock. If then I heard words, they were, why not come out from hiding? You're an archetype, I flung back, so go away, or said, nah. Listen, says Christ, Listen, be deaf. You are deaf. Now you aren't. Listen, I will be back. Meantime, keep that wisdom. It helps you. Do what? Oh, die. Or, if you listen, to hear the lie under each old friend's warning, the old habitual single lie, to know you are blind. Now, in my light, go seeing. Okay, when you're talking about the intellect and the thing making sense and being worthy of study and so on, that aspect of the Pentecostalism wasn't kind of strongly emphasised or developed. So I think perhaps Bob found that a bit unsatisfying, that he possibly found it more stimulating and satisfying to read the older evangelicals like C.S. Lewis, and even though G.K. Chesterton was a Roman Catholic, he wrote like an evangelical and he was a hero to the evangelicals. When the word evangelical means taking the Bible on face value and studying it at face value, being prepared to ask questions, but taking it seriously. And so that was what meant something to Bob. We were in the church together because we were in the church together. That's where we'd landed. We got saved, and that's where we got saved. And so that's where we planted ourselves for the time being. And Bob, and things changed and developed. The church became a bit more intellectual, started a Bible college. Bob became a teacher at the Bible college. That's where he taught his writing course. He put together a magazine for the church with contributions from various writers in the church. So I guess you could say that he was developing, he had a functional role in the church, as well as learning the basics. It was I guess the attraction, to answer your question, is that a biblical faith challenges our intellect, and you've got to do a bit of intellectual work to get an idea what it's demanding of you, in a sense. There's a poem in The Cloud Passes Over on page 17 called Isaiah by Kerosene Lantern Light. And there's something about reading the Bible in solitude that makes it real, if you're prepared to take it on as truth. And it challenged, I think what he says in this poem casts him as an outsider to his peers. This is what he says. Let me see where I can start. Towards the end of the poem Isaiah by Kerosene Lantern Light, he says, I believe this wick and this open book in the light's oval, and I disbelieve everything this generation has told me. For me, the poems that thrill me personally are the few religious poems, I think there's about half a dozen of them in The Cloud Passes Over particularly. From my point of view, just that line, I believe in this book, and I disbelieve everything this generation has told me, speaks volumes to the times that we're living in. And I'm really speaking only personally, that I still long for that sort of freedom, for that point of view to be expressed, for there to be a validity in the preservation of the work of a Christian man who saw himself as a serious poet, as a person who worked hard at the industry of creating poetry, the heart that was in his poetry, such as the poems of the sinking of the HMAS Sydney, the sincerity that's in Bob's poetry, the uncleverness of much of it, the desire to speak the heart of a simple man in choosing a precise vocabulary that challenges the intellect, the desire to express the colours of the Australian landscape, of the intellectual Australian landscape. The fact that he did all that work, the people who loved him and knew him in my scene really rejoice that his work is being acknowledged after all these years.